I'm Professor Tom Palaima. I'm a professor of classics. I study both ancient history and modern history and how war and violence affects human beings both individually and social groups throughout human history.
I'm Steve Sonnenberg. I'm a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, a professor, a clinical professor of psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine, and a fellow of the Humanities Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. I've had a very long-standing interest in treating veterans and treating people civilians who've experienced war trauma.
I think the watershed really is World War I. At the outset of World War I, Sigmund Freud wrote two classic essays about 6 months into the war. One is called Disillusionment in the Time of War, and he spoke to what modern societies feel when war is declared, the official war between one nation and another. Of course, Freud believed that we acquire our values through a nurturing process. So that is, we're not born with particular values, but we acquire them. And therefore, he said, what common citizens will feel is a tremendous amount of disillusionment because they've been conditioned to behave one way, and then as soon as war is declared, and it's often a rather formal and sudden declaration, the whole value system of society changes. Where you were supposed to be open and friendly and supportive of other people, all of a sudden you are told to be secretive, to look upon somebody as a potential enemy. Where one is taught, thou shalt not kill, all of a sudden you're being programmed to go out and kill, and so forth. And this was particularly upsetting in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century because the Europeans had deluded themselves to into believing that in the 40 or 50 years since the Franco-Prussian War, they had had no large-scale violence right on European soil. And therefore, this is what spawned the phrase, the war to end all wars, about the First World War. They simply did not imagine that such a thing could take place again. And so there was a tremendous amount of disillusionment about that. And also misconceptions about what the war would entail. They were not prepared for what mechanized war would do to their whole conception of what war was about.
I do think the question about how war has changed is important, and also how war is seen, is observed, and I think there are many dimensions to that. But you know, one of the dimensions of change is that, in many ways, with the kinds of fighting that is conducted today, in many cases, the devastation isn't fully experienced by some of the combatants. Right. I mean, air power has changed the nature of warfare, and very powerful bombs, well, you know, they're dropped by people who don't really appreciate what happens when they land. And, you know, there's huge devastation on the ground, but the people inflicting the damage don't really see it. I mean, that's one difference. But from my perspective, one of the things about the perception of war over a very long period of time is that people really don't want to understand its devastation. They prefer to think in terms of romanticized versions of warfare, and not of the devastation that it creates.
Yeah, and there are two factors there, I think. One of the real ironies is that even though In almost all cultures, there are prohibitions against killing your fellow citizens and so forth. Nonetheless, war has always been a part of human society. So at one and the same time, you have to prepare people in a kind of circumscribed area of human existence to go out and kill for the benefit of your particular society. And in my long view of history, between the ancient times and the modern times, one of the real problems is Christianity. Christianity bringing in this notion of a kind of universal love of mankind. This was not known to the Greeks at all. So the Greeks were very clear about the fact that you could fight and you would fight on behalf of your own society. In fact, one of the tag phrases that's found repeatedly in Greek tragedy is, the best thing in life is to harm your enemies and help your friends. And when Christianity comes in and says, no, you're supposed to turn the other cheek, not use violence, one has to even develop things like just war theory and so forth. But it creates I think, a great internal conflict inside the human psyche. And the other thing, I mean, you're quite right in pointing out too that the degree of the mechanization of the world, which began in World War I, has just gone now to an extreme point, and therefore it more and more isolates the individual within the sphere of combat, so that one of the helpful things that can get a soldier, somebody who's experienced war firsthand, past the trauma is the camaraderie of war. But the camaraderie falls apart when you're being overwhelmed with rocket fire, artillery, and so forth. So the mechanization has had a terrible effect on the experience of war.
One of the things that we know people do when they're in warfare, because of a certain tendency that people do have to want to be treated well, and to recognize that if one wants to be treated well, there's a better chance one will get that if one treats others well. I mean, I think that is part of being human.
Right.
And Christianity, you know, certainly has concretized that in the West. But the question is, what do people do when they're told to go to war, and when they're trained to go to war, and when they're told that there is an imperative to go to war? And one of the things that people do is they create mischaracterizations of the enemy.
That's right.
Sometimes that's called cartoonizing the enemy. So during the Vietnam War, for example, a very common phenomenon was to develop a caricature of the Vietnamese, of the values of the Vietnamese people. Mm-hmm. And soldiers routinely ignored the fact that Vietnam was a very child-loving and child-centered culture. And that was basically denied in the mischaracterizations that American combat troops had when they were fighting in Vietnam. And that made it a lot easier to commit the kinds of horrible war crimes that actually became a fairly routine part of the Vietnam War. You deny its devastation, and you caricature the enemy so that, and that goes along with the denial, so that you can engage in violence without fully recognizing in yourself what it really means. When the enemy is not cartoonized, not dehumanized, you realize that you're killing somebody who was just like you,
yeah,
and it makes you it causes an identification with the enemy, which makes it much harder to carry out those kinds of acts.
Yeah, well, yeah, and in fact, it's it's part of almost all the literatures of wars that I'm familiar with, that at some point soldiers recognize who these people are that they've been trained to view as almost subhuman, other than themselves. Even in the so-called good war, you know, you mentioned Vietnam, but in the Second World War especially, the Germans were the Krauts, the Japanese were the Nips, and there were racial distinctions certainly in the Pacific that came into play. But and the fighting in the Pacific theater was horrendous. Iwo Jima, for example, the Japanese were dug into these bunkers that even long-term shelling did not put out of action, and they were set up, and there was an elite force that was there to meet the attack of the American forces. And so it was the one battle in the Pacific Campaign where American casualties actually outnumbered Japanese. There were atrocities committed on both sides. And nonetheless, in Studs Terkel's The Good War, Marines talk about going by dead Japanese soldiers and seeing that they were just kids like them. They could have been college students, they could have been their buddies in a factory in Detroit, and it was that realization that sort of brought them back into some form of human association. Now, the interesting thing about the ancient Greek experience is that there was never a demonization of the enemy of this sort. In fact, people marvel at the Iliad as a national epic because the Trojans are viewed in some ways even more sympathetically than the Greek forces themselves. I mean, it's in looking at Troy that we see the humanness, the human relationship between Hector, the great leader of the Trojans, and his wife and child, the relationship between Hector and his mother and father, who are the king and queen of Troy, and so on. So the Iliad has to present, or tries to present, both sides of combat, the attacking force and the defending force, and in so doing makes both sides human, and also shows the severe effects that war has on both sides. So it's a much, much different thing than what we see in the 20th century. And I think it's a harmful thing, what we've done in the 20th century. I don't know how you feel about that.
When you say what we've done in the 20th century, are you referring to the dehumanization or demonization of the enemy?
Because there's even still in World War I, well, and also there are these little parts of other wars. I mean, in actual accounts, where it was famous that the high commands on both sides had to issue an edict against fraternization between the Germans and the British and the French, the first Christmas on the so-called Western Front from the German perspective. The British and French forces came forward, the German forces came forward, and they fraternized in no man's land during the truce, and this was thought to be horrible, but what they were doing is recognizing each other's humanity. And the fact that just months before they had been in peaceful contact with one another.
Of course, you see, the thing about, in my view, whether we demonize, dehumanize, cartoonize the enemy, or whether we don't, whether we recognize that they are like us and that their pain is like our pain. Regardless of which of those options one takes psychologically, engaging in war is traumatizing.
That's right.
There's no escape. When people take up arms and destroy others, whether we see them as subhuman or as just like us, or even better than us, you know, it's irrelevant. War, there are no victors in war. There are no people who come out of it without trauma. And we can see that in the wake of the Second World War, where in every segment of European society, victors, vanquished, civilian victims, Holocaust victims, it doesn't matter. Nobody gets a free pass.
Right.
Everybody ends up traumatized.
Well, it was interesting to me that you said you were focused on Europeans. Would you think there was a different experience in the United States because the civilian population in the United States was so sheltered from the effects of war?
Well, you know, I'm not sure about that because certainly many veterans of World War II struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and certainly the people they came in contact with, I mean, their family members,
right.
their friends, suffered alongside them.
Maybe another way of putting it, because you know, one of the things we were interested in is what's going on now with the American society. So one of the ways one of the crucial issues, and it goes back to the original question about, you know, what do people know about wars and how have things changed maybe over the course of the 20th century or in relation to past history. In fact, in the First World War began a conscious effort by government and military to shelter the home population from what was really going on, because the realities were all of a sudden so horrid that there wasn't any romance anymore in war. There wasn't any glory anymore to be had in war. You couldn't have it if you had gas attacks, machine gun fire, barbed wire, aerial bombardment. I mean, this took away the glory of hand-to-hand combat, if there ever was such a thing. Whether it was right or not, the British government, the German government, you know, veterans on both sides are shocked at the appalling ignorance of the people back home when they return. These people have no idea what trench warfare was. And it's the same in World War II. There was a prohibition against showing American GIs being shot and so forth, so that the home front was, and Vietnam was the major exception in this way. The government and the military were sort of asleep at the switch, and they allowed reporters and cameramen to go out into the spheres of action, show live action photographs, interview soldiers in the middle of firefights. And so you really got a sense of the brutality of war, which you didn't have in prior wars. And once they learned that lesson, the control of information has become more and more extreme as time has gone on.
Well, one theme that I would emphasize is that I don't think we really have good data on the aftermath in the United States of World War II versus Vietnam versus what's going on today. You know, Tom Brokaw writes this wonderful book about the greatest generation, and you know, I think there is a truth that we welcomed back the veterans of World War II in a very positive and robust way. There was a real effort to provide them with benefits, GI benefits, and I think there was a feeling that this was a just war, that it was a necessary war, that we were defending ourselves and our lives and our future and our democracy. And I think that at least the mythology is that the veterans fared better psychologically, and so did their family members, because there was that united perception and cognition about what was done. Now, what I don't really know is how many alcoholic, homeless people were living on the Bowery in New York in 1950 as a result of war trauma. I don't know that that information will ever be available. So it really isn't clear to me whether they really did fare better, or how many of them lived out lives of hopeless desperation in Boise, Idaho, or Keokuk, Iowa, or the south side of Chicago, or for that matter, in Highland Park in Dallas. Right. I don't know. But the common theme, and this I do know, is that, and again, I'll repeat it, nobody gets a free pass. There is a ubiquitous experience of trauma. And one of the ways we try to deal with it is by employing psychological mechanisms which screen it out. Right. I mean, we just try very hard to ignore it. And we continue to try very hard to glorify war, to imagine that those who fight in it are doing something noble, which in some cases they may be, but are doing something noble that is something they embrace without conflict, without ambivalence, that they're glad they did it, that they don't have bad memories of what they've done, and that's, to me, that's just not the way it is.
Yeah, well, and that again is a clear difference between the ancient Greek experience and the modern experience too, as we were discussing. The ancient Greeks, when the Athenians had a mechanism for publicly acknowledging the horrors of war that their soldiers had gone through, these great dramatic festivals where they would represent the horrors of war, and the audience that was watching was the collected community along with the soldiers who had been experiencing the things that were then being shown. And Aristotle talks about the very purpose for which this was done, to evoke sympathy. We say pity and fear, but pity is really just sympathy, putting yourself in the place of these soldiers. And there was also a universal conscription. I mean, everyone was a soldier, so there weren't large parts of a population that had no understanding even of the basic training or what kinds of efforts have to be put forward and what kinds of trauma one are going to experience. One of the kind of universals in war literature, in fact, is that a soldier is a slave. It's the only, I mean, when you think about it, it's the only profession in society where someone can't simply say, well, that's it, I quit. If you're anything else, a doctor, a judge, any other profession, you can at some point, you certainly will suffer consequences financially and otherwise, but you can say, I've had it, I'm not going to do that any longer. But if you're a soldier, you can't do that. And therefore, well, Tim O'Brien in his great book, The Things They Carried about the Vietnam War, has a prescript, that is a dedication that is excerpted from an account of a Civil War prison, Andersonville. And why does he do that? He doesn't explicitly tell us why, but the message is, once you've said, I'm going to be a soldier, you've lost control of your own being, and then you can be put in situations where, as Jonathan Shea says, your sense of proper moral judgment, the proper care and concern that should be taken for your life, after all, isn't there. It's missing. You're treated like a tool, and commanding officers will make bad decisions and will cause human lives, and you see that happening, and you say, well, I don't want to be part of this any longer, but you can't go anywhere because you're caught in the situation. And it just strikes me that the real importance of the whole American citizenry understanding what's going on, and also being able to discuss it openly. I mean, right now, if you, we had a long period where you couldn't even see a flag-draped coffin. We've never had graphic images. You've probably experienced this, Steve. I went over to a conference in 2004 in Sweden, and I turned on the BBC television, and there were live interviews with American combat forces in the middle of serious fighting. And we got none of that here in the United States. And there'll be graphic images of what the costs of war are. I mean, people get blown apart, people get traumatized. And if this is hidden from us, when these people come back home, we have no ability to, there's no common ground for conversation. It takes a long time to get to any kind of meaningful dialogue and solution to the trauma that these soldiers have suffered.
You know, in that regard, it's interesting because there certainly was a shift during the Vietnam War. And at a certain point in time, a war that began as a noble enterprise and to prop up a good government and to wage what was initially thought of as a necessary and just war. Well, it became clear that that was not the case, and there certainly was a great deal of public discourse. What's interesting is that while that may have helped some veterans and some families who were affected by the war directly, the fact is that the war still had a devastating effect on many, many, many combatants and people who were related to them, knew them, were members of their families. So you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that it requires to really have the best possible cultural environment to help people deal with acts of violence that they've committed and that have been committed against them? And if we assume, and this is, frankly, this is my assumption, I don't think we're going to eradicate war.
No, I agree with you on that.
I mean, would that we could, but I don't think it's going to happen. Right. So how do you deal with it? And to me, and maybe here we can learn important lessons from the world's great religions, Christianity included. You know, there are cycles of prayer that are repeated over and over and over again. Certainly in Judaism, if you read the Bible, there are descriptions of tremendous violence.
Right.
And one, in the course of one's observance, one encounters that regularly. And then there are days when redemption is sought, where one, and again, I'm speaking about Judaism, but the same applies to Christianity.
Christianity as well,
And in the course of seeking redemption, one acknowledges what one has done wrong.
Right.
And that becomes institutionalized. And if it's properly institutionalized and it's taken seriously, that's repeated and repeated and repeated. And I think that's what the Greeks did.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, the great myth of war for the Greeks, the Iliad, starts out, I mean, people are literally surprised because you can often read things and not see it for what it is. I had this experience, I think I mentioned to you. I taught something called a Telluride seminar here at UT for gifted high school juniors becoming seniors. And my friend Stacy Peebles, Professor Stacy Peebles, who's an expert on the aesthetics of violence in film and so forth, she and I were teaching this class, and we had to make a decision at the start. Did we teach it to rising high school seniors at the same level of honesty and openness and graphic detail as we would teach to UT juniors.
Right.
And we eventually decided to do that. And the students who would read things like the Red Badge of Courage or All Quiet on the Western Front, or the things they carried, or the Iliad, the great classics of Western war literature, the Bible included. At one point, about 3 weeks in, they said, you know, we read this in high school, but we never really talk about what is at the core of it. And this is exactly it seems to me, the most crucial problem. In other words, how do you get people to really take these things seriously when so much is constructed to keep people from, to make people not look at things. And this is the really serious challenge, because again, you can even take the formal structures of Judaism and Christian religion. Christian religion has that same structure. You're reading through the Old and the New Testament through the course of the year, but you can read it in such a way that you really don't see the seriousness of these passages. The seriousness when you talk about poverty, when you talk about the violence of war, when you talk about the passions. You probably have this with your patients who are veterans. I've had it in talking to veteran groups. The one thing that they want most is for people just to understand what the reality of it was. And so if you're coming back to a population that has no sense of what they've been through, and worse yet, is almost conditioned not to look.
Exactly.
Then this is going to be a tremendous problem for reintegrating into society.
And you know, thinking about our Humanities Institute seminar, I mean, one of the problems that intellectuals have in dealing with crisis is that there's a certain tendency to fall back into let's just say, minute aspects of intellectual discourse.
That's it. You just want to deal with these things, as Hemingway said. Words like valor and glory and honor are almost obscene alongside the concrete realities of the war. And what should people do in the current situation when we have a very small portion of our population going off and fighting wars in very remote places, so remote that I doubt whether, I think there are a considerable number of Americans, including myself, who, given a map of the region without any designation as to which country is which, might be hard-pressed to say, okay, this is Iraq, this is Iran, this is Afghanistan, this is Uzbekistan, this is Pakistan. So what do we do in order to make it so that when soldiers return and these effects of violence radiate outward through people they come in contact with, that each and every one of us can be part of the solution? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, you know, what comes to mind is a personal experience I had a number of years ago. I was at Auschwitz. I was visiting Auschwitz, and I observed a couple of groups of young people carrying large Israeli flags that were waving in the wind, and they were walking across these open fields and looking at the buildings and the gas chambers and the incineration facilities. And what I learned was that every Israeli youth visits the concentration camps in Europe. And I don't think that they're sending them there to hate Germans.
Right.
I think they're sending them there to understand something about human nature. So when you ask me what can we do, I think the first thing we have to do is try as a culture to accept what is true about human nature. And that includes how aggressive we can be and how vulnerable we are, and how we really do have to take responsibility as an entire culture for the consequences of that aggression and that vulnerability.
That's it, yeah.
And what follows from that is, well, you know, how about instead of the traditional class trip to Washington, D.C., how about including in that a visit to Walter Reed Army Hospital and a visit with permanently maimed veterans?
Yeah.
How about a recognition that the emotional consequences of war are lifelong? How about that being taught in the schools and taught maybe by mental health professionals who really know? And that doesn't mean teaching pacifism, but that means teaching reality about human nature. I mean, I think that's a start, because that would then result in people embracing each other in the recognition that this is part of the human condition. And it's, you know, in some ways it's the issue of tragedy in the human condition. But, you know, we can't just embrace the joy in the human condition.
And on the other side, there's a political dimension too, because one of the things that inhibits an understanding of the realities of war is also the idea that any kind of publicly voiced criticism is unpatriotic. I mean, the Greeks would have the Greeks, the Romans, and many other cultures would have very little patience with that kind of attitude, but it prevails in our society. That is, I remember my parents saying that particular subjects were absolutely taboo. You don't talk politics and so forth. Well, the whole point of being a political animal in Aristotle's definition is to be an active member of a polis. And the Greeks, even in the Athenians, even in the middle of what was a 27-year-long world war, had, alongside the tragedies, had the most open public criticism of leaders, because leaders will make mistakes. There hasn't been one leader in the history of the world who hasn't made plentiful mistakes. And war, as you know, von Clausewitz says, there's the fog of war. You never know in what direction, what the unintended consequences of an action in war are going to be. So if we don't encourage open and honest discussion without vilifying people who have opposite views of ours, whether you're on the right, left, or the middle, you should feel free to say, what we need to do here is come to a proper solution, and the only way we're going to come to a proper solution is by having an open and honest discussion. Start in your local club or organization. Start with having people over for dinner. And you don't have to discuss things aggressively. Just say, hey, what do you think about Obama's decision to send 30,000 more troops? Do you think this is sensible or not? You can start by making small baby steps in terms of addressing the political realities along with the human and psychological reality. Well, Steve, it's been very good talking.
As always.
As always.